If you are writing a screenplay with a female protagonist, you have to read this chapter because there are 10 stages in this journey and it is incredibly eye-opening. I'm humbled by reading this and going, wow, there's so much I don't know.
Especially useful for male screenwriters. And if you want to write a female protagonist or a female character, you do have to open your eyes and learn.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Scriptcake podcast. I am your host, Lavinder Gill, and really excited to talk about this week's guest, Bill Indick, about his new book, actually about a new edition of his book, Psychology for Screenwriters, Building Conflict in Your Script. Bill is highly educated. He is the first PhD that we've had on the Scriptcake podcast that I know of. He got his undergraduate in psychology, his master's in music therapy, and his PhD in developmental psychology from Cornell University. He is also an author, screenwriting consultant, screenwriter, professor of psychology, and like I mentioned, the book that we're going to talk about today, Psychology for Screenwriters. He also has a few other books as well. He's a very prolific writer. Media Environments and Mental Disorder, The Psychology of Misinformation Immersion. The Digital God, How Technology Will Reshape Spirituality. Ancient Symbology in Fantasy Literature, a psychological study. Psychology of the Western, How the American Psyche Plays Out on Screen. Psychothrillers, Cinematic Exploration of the Mysteries of the Mind. And Movies of the Mind, Theories of the Great Psychoanalyst Applied to Film. That is a mouthful. How do you turn out so many books, Bill?
It's just time. It's been 20 years of writing books, and you just keep at it. Keep yourself open to new ideas. I suppose is a good recommendation for any writer, whether it's a screenwriter or a book writer or a novel writer. Just keep yourself open to new ideas and let yourself get excited about them, and then the writing flows naturally.
Well, I am actually excited about your writing because I'm someone who deeply believes in the psychology and how important that is in screenwriting. I've actually had, older students, the continuing ed students that take my classes in the past, just smile at me and go, "This is cheaper than therapy. Thank you," because it's so much about learning about their stories from within themselves and then applying that. But you've taken it to a whole new level with this book. And just for people that are not familiar, let me give you some context. In the early chapters, you talk about great psychologists like Sigmund Freud, Erik Erikson, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, Maureen Murdoch, who I had not heard of before I read this book. So I want to talk to about her a little bit, as well as Alfred Adler and Rollo May. Maureen Murdoch talks about the heroine's journey.
Right.
And I feel upset at myself that I'm not aware of her work and I am not knowledgeable about it, because from time to time I do write screenplays with a female lead. And reading this chapter that you broke into beautiful pieces, I have never looked at it that way. Can we talk about her heroine's journey a little bit?
Sure. Maureen Murdoch is not a famous theorist like Sigmund Freud or even like Joseph Campbell, from whose work hers is derived. But when reading all of these really, these classic theories, and I should note that another sort of classic personality theory or theory of psychoanalysis has not been introduced to the field of psychology in at least 50 or 60 years. And that's because, there's only so many great ideas that we have room for in the way that we can understand the human psyche. So all of these classic theories are very androcentric, meaning very male focused. And most androcentric of them all is Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, because it's very, very much a story of a man in a man's world trying to accomplish man's goals. And the women come in either as a sort of temptress figure or as a sort of healing figure, but they don't have much role, very important roles beyond that. And that was true for classical mythology a few thousand years ago, and thousands of stories have been told using that model. But it's a different time, and it's a time where women are heroes just like men. But a female hero's journey is not going to be the same as a male hero's journey because each character is going to face different challenges in their environment. So I felt it was necessary even back then in 2004 to add some diversity, to add an alternate voice to the theories being explored. So I used Murdoch's book, and it is an excellent complement to Joseph Campbell's theory because it does, first of all, make out the point that the heroine's journey is different from the hero's journey, and then it explicitly says why, and it's very relevant.
Yeah, when I was looking through it, like I was actually shocked at the stages. I was surprised that that is actually what the journey is. But the more I started thinking about it and I started picturing different movies, I'm like, oh my God, I see it. And so
the hero's journey or the heroine's journey?
The heroine's journey. So stage one, separation from the feminine. Can you talk about that? Let's just go through two or three of these stages because I really want to delve into them a little bit deeper.
Right. And it's interesting because Joseph Campbell's stages, there are 17 stages. But the hero's journey, the classical hero's journey is pretty much straightforward. He knows what a hero is, and he has a mentor to help him fulfill that role. Whereas the heroine's journey is much more complicated because her traditional archetype that she has been encouraged to identify with is old and antiquated. It's the traditional feminine. So the woman who is expected to have children and be a good mother and a good wife and nothing more. Not that that's not enough, but she is not expected to go out into the world and to accomplish things in this sort of external realm of accomplishment in the way that men are. So her first step is not to find a mentor and find her challenge, find her sense of self. Her first step is to say, you know what, this very ancient, antiquated notion of what a female is not going to apply to me. I'm going to be creating my own path on my own journey. So her first step is to separate. And it brings us away from that traditional path in the very first step.
Yeah. And then in step two, which is the one that actually surprised me the most, I didn't expect to see step two, it's identification with the masculine.
Right. So if we're talking about a sort of 20th century character, and if we look at the 20th century, that was, of course, the century of the greatest change in human history. The 21st century might be the same or it might not. But when we get to the beginning of the 20th century, women couldn't vote. Women, for the most part, weren't expected to go to school. They weren't expected to have careers. They were living as second-class citizens. And then as the 20th century proceeded, they gained the vote, they gained power, they gained social mobility, and the entire role of the feminine changed. So separation from the feminine in this sense means separation from the mother archetype, the traditional mother archetype. If you're going to separate from that archetype, then who are you going to identify with? Because we all need an identification figure. So the obvious identification figure will be with the father or with the male mentor figure.
So as I dug in deeper and deeper, I think the one stage that I really loved was stage 7, the urgent yearning to reconnect with the feminine. So can you talk about this kind of full circle and how it changes the character?
Right. And this goes back to, it's kind of almost a media psychology principle that when anything new comes along, say like a new technology like this smartphone over here, it gives us an enhancement. It improves our life in some way. So in the case of the cell phone, it helps us communicate. It helps us have direct access to other people. We can text message, we can email, we can do all these wonderful things with the smartphone. And that's obvious and on the surface. But what we don't miss is the obsolescence, or the thing that becomes obsolete. So for instance, you might have a landline at home that's not plugged in anymore because a landline is obsolete. And there might be other ways that you used to do things, such as, for instance, this interview in and of itself, in the past might have been done in writing, or it might have been done in person, but it wouldn't have been done on this technology because this technology didn't exist in the past.
Right.
That being said, it probably would have been nice to say hi without having to worry about the speakers not working and the technology not working. Meaning there's a beauty and simplicity to communication that we lose when it becomes more technologically sophisticated. And we
Mhm.
apply that to people too. So when a person takes on a new archetype, when a person says, okay, I'm going to be a woman that is going to direct movies and write movies and is going to accomplish amazing things outside of the home, that's what she gains. That's what the enhancement is. But she's always going to lose something. She's going to, in the case of the 20th century woman, what she lost was time to spend with her children, or time to have children and be a traditional mother, time maybe spent with her spouse or with her partners, with her friends. So the challenge of becoming a conqueror, a gladiator in the world of external conquest comes at the price of abandoning these traditional roles. So again, the female heroine is going to have a different story, and part of her story is going to be a reconnection, meaning how can I get back in touch with the things that I had to sacrifice in order to be the hero in the classical sense.
That's fascinating. It really is.
And it's interesting because the hero doesn't have to deal with these challenges at all. These are
right.
to the heroine.
No, it really opened my eyes as I was reading it, because like I said, I've written female, protagonists in my screenplays, and I'm using, I guess, an antiquated model for that, because
If you're using Joseph Campbell's model,
right.
it's not necessarily, it's antiquated and not necessarily fitting. We still wind up using Campbell's model for the hero because the hero hasn't substantially changed.
Mm-hmm.
Hasn't had to change. His role, the role of the male didn't change in the 20th century.
Right.
Well, the female did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No. So if you are writing a screenplay with a female protagonist, you have to read this chapter, because there are 10 stages in this journey, and it is incredibly eye-opening. And I'm humbled by reading this and going, wow, there's so much I don't know. I've been doing this for only 25 years. And the more I do it, the more I realize how much more there is for me to know. So
especially useful for male screenwriters, because we think we understand other people's journeys, but we don't. And this is a useful tool to awaken us to the fact that women indeed have different journeys than men. And if you want to write a female protagonist or a female character, you do have to open your eyes and learn.
No, absolutely. And I know that from, here on forth, and maybe even revisiting some of my older scripts, I will go back and see how this applies and how it can help me. So no, I really appreciated that. But the main focus of today's conversation is on version 2 of this book, your second edition, which has 3 new chapters in it. Mm-hmm. I really wanted to dig into these chapters because as I was reading them, like, I would just sit back and go, that makes perfect sense. And I think maybe on a deep level, I was aware of it to some extent, but on a conscious level, it's like I just never did the math.
That's really what psychology is. Almost everything that could be said to be sort of helpful or true in psychology is what people already know intuitively, but they didn't make it explicit. They didn't write a theory about it. When people ask me about like psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, for the most part, anything useful that somebody can tell you could be told to you by a good friend or a clever aunt. None of it is mystery or magic. It's intuitive stuff that we know about ourselves, but we haven't consciously thought about it. We haven't worked out the nuts and bolts to figure out how we can actually take that knowledge and change ourselves or change our behavior.
No, absolutely. And I think the most that hit me in is chapter 8, writing for the Western genre. I flipped in the first couple pages, and one of the lines that you wrote just kind of hit me over the head is, when writing your Western, remember that the mythical landscape of the wild frontier is the primary character in the story.
Exactly.
And no, I just sat back and I'm just like, I think I assumed it was a character in the story. I know there's a lot of tropes that go on with Westerns that you see. And, you even talk about the opening shot and the closing shot of the cowboy riding into town and, the mountains and, and cowboy, riding out of town. But I never thought of it as the primary character. Can you tell me why it's the primary character?
And it's interesting because sometimes people think when people ask a question, they think the answer is going to be complicated or profound, when oftentimes the answer is so simple that they know it already, and they're like, wow, I knew that, I just didn't get it. So when people say, well, what is the Western about? What is the sort of prime concern of the Western? The Western is about the West. That's it. Well, now, what do we mean by the West? Well, in American mythology, the West represents the frontier, the wilderness, this wild, savage place that we as Americans decided needed to be tamed primarily by Europeans. To step aside from all of those sort of racial and social overtones for a second, if the core theme in the Western is the West itself, how to survive on this frontier with all of the danger and all of the lawlessness, that gives you a sense of the danger that's going to be involved. There can be no Western without danger, without the threat, the mortal threat of danger for the characters. And there can be no Western without some type of battle that represents the battle between the savage and the civilized. Those are the core themes of the Western, and they come from the setting itself. It doesn't mean that every Western has to be set in Texas in 1850 or whatever, but it means that it has to be set in a wild place, in a place that could be conceived as a frontier, whether it's outer space for the 21st century or Alaska in the 20th century. Wherever that place of danger is, wherever the savage and the civilized meet and come into conflict, that is.
Yeah, you talk about the Mandalorian a little bit later, so I'll get to that a little bit later. I have a couple questions before that, or a couple of thoughts here. Having the landscape be the primary character, you mentioned it explains why the hero rarely gets the girl in the end, but instead rides off to the sunset, back to the wilderness, his one true love. Like, I've seen that happen 500 times in movies. Never dawned on me that, it reminds me of that song, Brandy. You're a fine girl. What a good wife you will be. But my life, my love, and my lady is the sea. And I'm like, oh, that's what the Westerns are about. It's the same thing as a sailor, basically. Yes.
Very simple. Yeah, the hero always has to, I'm not always, but maybe 90% of the time. The traditional ending is the hero rides off into the sunset. And that comes back, that harkens back to the Knights of the Round Table. These knights errant who would roam around ancient England and find maidens in distress or find a quest to go on, but they would never settle down. They would always, once one quest was finished, they would go on another, because their role was the role of the knight errant. So, and it's the same, it's basically the same character in the Western. He can never settle down because he is part of this Western frontier, and it's a restless, quixotic character who's always sort of chasing a dream or being chased by his own demons.
And then another statement that jumped out to me was your connection of a cowboy and his horse to mythological characters, like a centaur in Greek mythology. Please expand on that.
So the idea is that in the Western, the hero is always attached to his horse. And we have to remember that the Western hero, that very, very, very masculine character, cannot express emotion. He can express anger through violence, but he cannot express fear, or he cannot express sentiment or empathy, or certainly cannot express vulnerability or weakness. All of his emotion is being expressed through his horse, through his relationship with his horse. If his horse gets hurt, he's in pain, emotional pain. If his horse is in danger, he's terrified. So the horse plays the same role that usually the love interest would play in the Western. Because, in the typical movie, the hero gets the girl. In the typical Western, the hero doesn't get the girl. He rides off into the sunset on his horse. So the horse is the only figure that he truly attaches to, and that he remains attached to in the beginning, middle, and the end. You will never see a more angry Western character than a character whose horse has been killed or abused. That is the ultimate insult and the ultimate need for revenge. The killing of a person is expected. The abuse of a person is expected. But the abuse of a horse goes beyond the beyonds, as they would say. So this relationship between the hero and the horse harkens back to that relationship between in the mythological character a character who becomes one with that identification animal. So the centaur, who is half man, half horse, has so identified with the horse character that he's become the horse character. And that's what we see in the Western. We also see this sort of idea that in mythological settings of men becoming intertwined with animals as a symbol of their of the wildness within them, the savage element within them, that they're not really men, they're manimals, or half man, half animal. The cowboy hero who is literally attached to the hip by his horse harkens back to that character who's not completely human. There's something wild and animalistic about him.
That's fascinating. Like, I don't know that I would have ever made that connection had I not read your book. And, you know, that got that quote. I think you got the quote from, is it Coelty? Coelty?
Yes, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Coelty, who wrote some great books about the mythology of the West.
Fascinating. Like, I mean, I got to tell you, like, my mind is blown by just that one comment, because I've never envisioned that. But now that you've mentioned it to me, it's as clear as a bell. And now I know when I'm creating characters and animals and whatnot, depending on the world I'm setting it in, you know, if it's a frontier world, like you say, a Western, that's an incredibly important element. It's like Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon is his horse in many ways.
Right.
It's almost like a part of it.
And when you watch Han Solo, the times when he's the most upset is the time when the Millennium Falcon is at risk. That's his cherished, that's his lover. It's the vessel that he, finds safety and security in. As long as he has the Millennium Falcon, he's okay. And whenever it's taken away from him, he's all of a sudden he's this lost, wandering character who doesn't know what to do with himself.
I love it. That's so good. So good.
I just want to mention that, for people who want to study film, whether that is in the interest of screenwriting or whatever other reason, the Western is the natural genre to study because it was the dominant genre for well over 100 years. Mm-hmm. And if you go back to sort of the classic age of films, almost every other feature film being made between 1939 and 1965 or so was a Western. So it's got this glorious tradition. There's been so many books and articles written about it. So there's this literature, this wealth of literature about the Western. And if we think of film as a sort of a mythological medium in and of itself, meaning that when we look at film, we see these heroic journeys that take us from our ordinary state of existence to this sort of mythological realm, archetypes and symbols. Well, the West is the American mythology. It is the mythical landscape of the American psyche. So within the Western genre, you have everything you need to know about the psyche of the American dream, the American spirit, why Americans are so conflicted in terms of violence, especially in terms of gun violence, why it's so difficult for us to relate to other countries because we like to do things independently and violently, and we don't like to answer to anybody else, meaning our national profile is that of the Western hero. And that's how other nations see us. That's how we see ourselves. So it is this incredibly important genre, not just for film and screenwriting, but just to understand who we are as Americans, and even more importantly, how others perceive us as Americans.
No, that's so accurate. I remember when I was in college, I studied abroad in England for a semester. And the one question that kept popping up from different, students that I met that were from England was, do you own a gun? Because in their minds, everyone in the US has a gun, and because in England, none of them have guns. And it was just, it was fascinating to just kind of hear that, but it makes so much sense now that you say that.
People don't understand the American love affair with the gun, which is very self-destructive. Probably our most self-destructive trait is our love affair with the gun. And the only way to understand that is to watch Westerns. If you watch Westerns, you'll understand the American obsession and fetish-like adoration of the gun. Other countries say, why can't you just ban guns? What's the problem? It's like, you don't understand what a sort of central emotional element this is in the American psyche. That's why it's so difficult to do something that seems relatively simple.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. And then one other element that I loved in your chapter on the Western genre is when you started talking about the artifacts of the terminal environment. I had never really thought of a Western as a terminal environment, but then you introduce,
Right.
something like railroads, that innovation represents modern civilization and the end of the old ways. And it has
Right.
a finite time limit to it. Tell me why
Mm-hmm.
that's so important in a Western.
When we think of the classic Western, it's usually set sometime between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century, or to push it a little bit, maybe World War I. That's not a lot of time. That's like around 1865 to 1915. That's only 50 years. And within those 50 years, you see almost every Western scenario ever written. Um, and it's a terminal environment because when the Civil War ended, that was the time when America as a nation decided, okay, the West is now open. There's no more internal conflict about who owns the West. And the only thing that might be a little bit controversial is how we're going to conquer the Western lands away from the indigenous people and make it European. So it was a terminal environment for the Native Americans because the end of the Native American way of life in America was predetermined by the end of the Civil War. So that's one aspect of the terminal environment is the Native American and everything about the Native American. Every aspect of the Native American, it makes you feel conflicted and say, oh, wow, we really did a pretty bad job on them. Genocide and war and famine and pestilence and everything you can imagine could befall a people befell the Native American at the hand of the Europeans. The buffalo themselves, they were living in a terminal environment. The literally millions and millions of buffalo that roamed the plains were all killed and decimated. They're coming back a little bit now, but there will never be the buffalo like the way they were. The way of life of living, especially for the old cattle barons, somebody owning millions of acres of land, one man who never really bought it. He just kind of took it from the Mexicans or the Native Americans, whoever was there. So that idea of one man owning a territory as large as a small state and ruling it like a tyrant, killing people, pushing people off his land, making all of the rules. That was terminal as well. That's not going to happen anymore. So we have these mythological elements of people that are being disenfranchised and marginalized and pushed off the land. Certain types of animals, wild mustangs, buffalo, who are being also killed, marginalized, pushed off the land. And also a way of life, a lifestyle that was about living on the land, an open landscape without fences, without borders. All of that's going away. So it's a very romantic time in the sense that we have all these things that are dying and are never going to come back. And it's a dangerous time, a time when death is going to happen to everyone. So everyone in that environment is going to die in some way, whether it's physically or just their way of life is going to die, or their people are going to die, or their country is going to die.
Yeah, you even talk about, I think, barbed wire was
right. Barbed wire represents the end of the open range, the end of the frontier.
Yeah, and again, once you say it, makes perfect sense, but I don't know that I could have done that math by myself. And that's why this book is so fascinating to me. Now, I could talk for our entire time about writing for the Western genre, and I'm still going to talk about one more thing, but you got to read this chapter, people. It's fantastic. I love where you say the Western hero is a simple character with simple and guileless motivations and goal. And it's a hero who is innately taciturn. The challenge is to define his character purely through his actions. So character is action. Can you expand on that?
That's I was reading The Last Tycoon, which is F. Scott Fitzgerald's last novel that he never completed. So I was reading it, and the edition I had what he had written and then his notes for the rest of the book. And he had one note written in all caps, and that note was "character is action." And I stole that from F. Scott Fitzgerald, but it's a great note because if you like, if you think of Fitzgerald novels, the thing that sort of pops out at you is the wonderful prose and the great dialogue, and what doesn't pop out at you is the character development. And you really have to sort of look a little bit closer to realize that everything he's doing, whether it's dialogue or whether it's this wonderful, pristine prose, everything he's doing is aimed at character, trying to develop character. And so that's a good note for any writer, because ultimately, when people watch a movie, what they're doing is they're looking for a character that they can identify with. They want to go on a little journey, but they don't want to get out of their chair. And they want to go on this journey vicariously on the back of this character. So all action has to revolve around that character, because that's the linchpin. That's what people are locking into and writing as they proceed on this journey. So you can have an action-packed movie, but if it doesn't relate directly to the character, it's going to leave the audience feeling unfulfilled. And I think that's really a failing of a lot of the modern action movies that do fine. They do fine worldwide. People pay the ticket because they want to see Mission Impossible and they want to see these amazing stunts. But nobody really remembers these movies because beyond the stunts and beyond all of the action, there's nothing really developing that character. In the Western, it's much different because the technology is much more simple. You got horses and guns, basically. Everything that every action the character takes has to be an expression of himself. So if the character is riding to the OK Corral to get into that shootout, that action is an expression of his character. The character is in a showdown and he's shooting at someone else or someone else is shooting at him. That action is directly related to the character. It's not this long 40-minute chase sequence with cars flipping over each other and all this stuff that's very, very fun to look at. But at the end, it leaves you with nothing. So a character is action, meaning everything the character does has to be in some way developing his character. And because the Western character, the lead character at least, doesn't say much, he has to express everything about himself by something that he does, as opposed to something that he says. And that's an interesting challenge for a screenwriter. We have to remember that the Western genre is the oldest genre of film, and it was born in the silent era, when by the restrictions of the medium alone, character is action. You had to express the characters by what you did. You had to minimize dialogue and maximize action. And so that's something that you can say is very, very true for the Western character, but it's also true for all characters.
Right.
You have characters explaining themselves in long monologues. You should certainly not have characters who are being explained by monologues being delivered by a narrator. That's a story, that's a written story, that's not a movie. The challenge of the movie is to tell your story through action. Mm-hmm. That's not always as clear as it is in the Western. It's so clear in the Western.
Right.
I'd like to just take a moment to compare two movies. One is Django by Quentin Tarantino. The second movie is The Hateful Eight with Kurt Russell. So if you compare those two Quentin Tarantino Westerns, Django is mostly outdoors. So there's mostly external settings. So you do get the sense that this is a Western because almost every scene we're seeing the Western landscape, and we have that feeling of connection to the land. If you look at The Hateful Eight, most of it takes place inside of a room, inside of a saloon. So it doesn't give you that feeling for the West, and therefore it's a less successful Western. I think when people say, if you ask, what was Quentin Tarantino's greatest Western, most people would say Django, because it gives you that feeling for the outdoors, and it gives you that feeling of that savage wilderness, which you don't get in The Hateful Eight. But then to get back to the point that we were just making, that in Django, the violence that takes place is directly related to the hero's quest. Anyone he kills, he's killing for a reason. And the more violent the action, the more dramatic it is for the character. Whereas in The Hateful Eight, there is a lot of violence, but none of it seems to happen almost sort of randomly as a sort of as the sort of dialogue moves along. The Hateful Eight revolves around dialogue, and Django revolves around action. That was the point that I was trying to get to that I temporarily forgot. And if you could watch those two movies and you could see where the Hateful Eight fails and where Django succeeds, it has everything to do with action. That the characters in Django are defining themselves through action, while the characters in the Hateful Eight are defining themselves primarily through their own dialogue. Mm. That falls short in the Western.
Well, not only that, just like how you said, the Django is filmed outside. If the West itself is the primary character, and you don't see that in Hateful Eight, that's another shortcoming.
Yeah, and we had this. I think it was either Coelty or maybe Richard Slotkin, who was another great writer about the Western. They said that the role of the Western film in the early part of the 20th century was to introduce America to Americans, because it was at a time where so many people were flooding into the cities, into New York and Chicago and Boston. So we had this explosion of immigrants living in cities, and they didn't really know what America was. They hadn't seen it. They had never gotten to the West. And most Americans don't get to the West. They don't really see this huge landscape and these hills and valleys and Monument Valley in Utah. They don't get to see it, only in the movies. So primary function of the Western is to expose America to America, the landscape of America, and the great beauty and majesty that is there, and that really defines our country in a physical sense.
Man, you're making my head spin. There's so much good information in here. Oh, wow. Now, I promised we would get back to The Mandalorian, because you talked about how the Western is all about new frontiers. I know probably one of my favorite television shows of all time, Firefly, was a straight up Western set in space. Are you familiar with that one as well?
I didn't watch it, but I'm familiar with it.
You got to watch it. It's fantastic. But let's talk about The Mandalorian. I think I was aware that it was a Western while I was watching it, but I don't think I was aware of how much homage it pays to the Western.
Right. Yeah, I was. I like Star Wars, and of course, Star Wars is a Western. And when I began watching The Mandalorian, I was really pleasantly surprised. I'm forgetting the name of the director and writer for most of those.
Jon Favreau.
Jon Favreau. Who I admire as a director, and I love his work. But when I saw what he was doing, when I saw that basically each episode was an homage to a classic Western, I was like, I love it. I loved it. And it was almost, like before I said, the role of the Western is to introduce Americans to the West. Or introduce Americans to America. I almost feel like the role of The Mandalorian and similar shows and movies is to introduce the Western to modern audiences who are not going to watch, Clint Eastwood movies or John Wayne movies, but they're going to watch these, episodes and these movies, and they don't realize it, but they're getting the plots and the characters from all of these classic Westerns. And it was such a clever thing to do. Somebody else maybe might have said, oh, that's redundant or that's derivative. But Jon Favreau knows. He knows that his audience hadn't seen The Magnificent Seven. They hadn't seen The Spectres, and they hadn't seen The Three Godfathers. So he knew these are these amazing, wonderful scenarios that are perfectly made for this frontier scenario. And what he did was really a wonderful thing. And he did a great job. The shows are entertaining. They're incredibly well done. And each one is an homage to a different Western, which is wonderful.
Do you have a list somewhere of which episode goes to which Western?
I mentioned the three primary ones, which would be Magnificent Seven, which is when you have a sort of ragtag band of misfits who have to get together to defeat the sort of evil empire. So in the episodes where the townspeople have to sort of rally behind the sheriff in order. In one scenario, they had to defeat this huge beast, this dragon or whatever it was called. In another episode, it was the Empire, the evil Empire. But that's a standard trope that we see in a lot of movies. But it's a West. Well, I don't know. Some people would argue that Magnificent Seven is not original because it was based on Seven Samurai, but Samurai in itself was based on other classic westerns.
Right.
The Three Godfathers is a classic Western scenario made several times, 2 times by John Ford himself, in which you have three tough outlaws who stumble upon a dying mother in the wilderness, and she gives them her baby. And now these three tough outlaws have to become devoted to this baby to deliver him out of the wilderness and into safety. And that is the overarching story of The Mandalorian. And also a lot of very specific episodes have very much to do with the Mandalorian shielding Baby Yoda and protecting Baby Yoda from the wilderness itself, from the different aspects of danger in the wilderness, such as the evil Empire. And then another example of a character that we see in many Westerns is the Jesse James character, the outlaw who has a shady past, not just because he did bad things, but because he was on the wrong side of history. Jesse James, we must remember, was a Confederate soldier, and he was a guerrilla soldier. He killed innocent women and children. He killed hundreds and hundreds of men in ambushes where the Union soldiers had literally no chance to defend themselves. So Jesse James is a conflicted character, not just because he's violent, but because he's racist and because he fought for the South. He fought on the wrong side of history. And the Western gives that character a chance to redeem himself. And we see the Bill Burr character in The Mandalorian get a chance to redeem himself because he fought for the evil empire. So we see all these sort of classic themes of redemption, the theme of the ultra masculine macho outlaw having to get in touch with his sort of feminine nurturing side in order to fulfill his quest. And we also see the theme of people living in the frontier having to get in touch with their savage wild side in order to defend themselves and simply survive in the Western scenario.
Man, again, that's just fascinating. I could talk about it all day, but we have to move on. So we're going to move on. I want to.
The Western is just this treasure trove of archetypes and scenarios and themes that that never ends. There's just because there's just so many thousands of Western scenarios were made over the past 100 years that it is this sort of endless magical box of scenario and symbol.
Yeah, you have another book just dedicated entirely to Westerns, the Psychology of the Western, right?
Exactly.
Does that go into a lot more detail than this chapter?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a much more in-depth psychological exploration. So what I did for the chapter in the screenwriting book was I just took all the stuff that I think would be useful for a screenwriter, and I put that in the chapter. But if you're interested in the Western beyond simply, what a screenwriter should know, I would suggest that book. And there's lots of other books. No other Western has as much literature written. I'm sorry, no other genre has as much literature written about it as the Western, because it has been such a dominant genre. And it is nice to see that the Western is still alive and still strong, and still not only in the sense that people are doing interesting things with it, like The Mandalorian, but people are making classic Westerns, in that sense, same sense.
No, yeah, you even referenced The Power of the Dog in here, which I was
sure.
Yeah, where they talk about him beating the horse, and that defines that defines who his character is, and it makes us hate him even more than would any other way. So no, it's fascinating.
I'll just note with Power, since it's a new movie, that's an interesting movie to watch, because you could see where it succeeds as a Western in its beautiful cinematography, and it does give you a wonderful sense of being in the land. And at the same time, it doesn't succeed as a Western because it's trying to take this very, very simple Western character and make him more complex than he's sort of designed to be. It's like putting too much software on a very basic laptop, and it doesn't work.
Right. Absolutely.
Interesting film to watch for someone to see, along with Hateful Eight, to see, where you can take a wrong turn with a Western.
Right. No, I'm going to definitely start watching some more Westerns, even though I'm not writing one. I want to go see it, and I want to go, delve into it a little bit deeper. Moving on to chapter 9. you start talking about writing for the fantasy genre,
Mhm.
and you specifically use Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth as your film for analysis. But
Mhm.
in it, you talk about the primary function of fantasy. As the real world is temporarily abandoned as we enter a place where anything can happen, and the possibilities are limited only by our imagination. And you connect that to childhood. Can you expand on
Right.
that?
When we're kids, fantasy is our sort of natural route of imagination because we don't really know much about the world. So we take what the little that we understand, and then the rest has to be imagined. And I think the older we get, the more our doors of perception close to the possibility of things happening because we understand, like, first of all, at a certain point, we give up on magic and we understand, well, magic doesn't really exist. And then
Mhm.
at a point, we give up on fate. And then, okay, fate and destiny don't really exist. And we give up on these fantasy elements of life as we grow older and learn from experience that they simply don't exist. We can't depend on a fairy godmother to save us. And we can't sort of have faith that everything will work out. We have to actually fix things for ourselves. So, but children haven't learned those awful lessons yet. They haven't learned to abandon faith, and they haven't learned that the world is not magical, and they haven't learned that enchantments can't help you. So it is a wonderful time where anything could happen. And the role of the film in general is to get us back in touch with fantasy, to get us back in touch with this realm of imagination where anything can happen. So a primary role of film is to reconnect us with our own fantasy worlds. Um, Now, in the case of specifically the fantasy genre, what we usually see is a lead character or a group of characters that are children. Why? Well, it's sort of it doubles the force. We intuitively know that children live in their own fantasy worlds because we remember that from our own childhood. So if you take the medium of film, which is a medium of fantasy, and then you take the child's mind, which is also the medium of fantasy, and you make the viewer get into the mind of that child within the fantasy scenario, well, then you just have this realm of pure imagination. Anything could happen, not just because it's a fantasy scenario, because you're experiencing it through the eyes of a child who believes in magic and who believes that anything can happen and who believes that the only limit to what could happen is your own imagination.
No, it's fascinating. And I think, and I'll use myself as an example. I'm still a child in that regard. You know what I mean? And I still like to think about those things in that same way, and as do many other adults that are out
Yeah.
there. um,
Anybody engaged in a creative medium has to be a little child, and since they have to be open to the possibility of anything, even if it's just in fantasy. And again, if we get to take the idea of growing up as a process of not just developing, but of shutting things down, shutting down to possibilities, getting back to childhood opens up all of our possibilities, and that's a
right.
very liberating feeling to be in for the viewer watching a fantasy film. And that's why there is the tendency for most fantasies to have a child protagonist.
No, it reminds me of a Picasso quote where he talks about, I think it took him 40 years to be able to paint like a child again, to remove the constraints that society has put upon us and forces you to draw inside the lines and things of that nature. And I think fantasy films allows for that same experience to happen.
Yeah,
So
and I think I talk a lot in that chapter about, you know psychologists are always trying to get to the essence of things, as if that exists. And I said, like, well, what is the essence of the Western? Well, it's the landscape itself. But that's not a simple statement, because once you say, well, what about the landscape is inherent to the Western? Well, it's all the stuff we talked about a moment ago. In fantasy, the essence is magic. That this is a magical place where with magical beings and magical things can happen. And so, if the West is about the conflict between the civilized and the savage within this terminal environment of the Western frontier, in fantasy, the conflict is between magic and its antithesis, which is logic. approaching the world from a logical, rational point of view, which is a very closed, myopic point of view. The idea that the only things that could exist are things that can logically be true. That's a very, 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 very narrow way of viewing the world. And that's the way that adults are forced to view the world. Those are our restrictions. So generally what we see in a fantasy film, beyond the plot itself, is this child character who is challenged by this idea that they know they have to grow up. They know they have to leave behind fantasy and magic and this world of infinite possibility to become an adult and become responsible, to limit their potential to these, one or two, three logical possibilities. That's a challenge that child has to deal with. In Pan's Labyrinth, it's very, very explicit. And it's a wonderful film because we have that central challenge of the child themselves, the child who knows they have to give up fantasy for the adult world of reality. But at the same time, there's this whole other scenario that's completely fantasy based, where there's, a faun who has magic, and there's all these magical things going on at the same time. So there's this wonderful, it's really three plots going on simultaneously, but that core plot is the one that we're all dealing with, meaning all of us viewers, is how do we get back to that place of childhood fantasy and infinite possibility? How are we going to get back to that when the world itself is forcing us to be narrow-minded?
So there's a couple things I want that just kind of stuck out to me. One is on page 218, you mentioned when writing your fantasy scenario, the primary issues you need to address are the following. And the first one is, what are your protagonist's deepest fears? And the second one is, from what, when, or whom does she need to escape? And why is it generally limited to those two things?
Because we're getting into the mind of the child.
Okay.
And have infinite possibilities, but so they're not reined in by logic or the need to exist in reality. But what they are reined in by are their fears. Because when you have infinite possibilities, that's not necessarily good. There's not just unicorns and magical fairies. Within the realm of infinite possibilities are monsters who want to eat you, literally want to chow down on you, bite you into pieces. And whether that's a magical creature or a reflection of a fear of a father figure or a fear of a mother figure or a fear of something in the real world that's being symbolized in the image of a monster, it doesn't matter. It's the same terror. So a child is living in a world of infinite possibility with a dark cloud of fear around it. And they're afraid of many things. Children are afraid, like we're all afraid, but children have a lot more to be afraid of because they're so defenseless, they're so vulnerable, and they're so weak, and they're so dependent on adults to protect them. So the greatest fear a child has is not necessarily being defenseless, but of having to defend themselves against the person who is supposed to defend them, meaning fear of a parental figure who has become violent towards them. How does a child get out of that situation if the person who you are deathly afraid of is that person that you're forced to stay with because it's your parent? The only way of dealing with that is through escape. You escape not literally but figuratively into your own world of fantasy, and we see that also in Pan's Labyrinth. The protagonist has only really one real way to escape Captain Vidal, this horrible father figure who by the end of the story literally wants to kill her. Her only means of escape is through this inner portal of her own fantasy world. So that's why fear and escape are these crucial motivations for the child protagonist character in the fantasy film.
No, that is fascinating. And I don't know that I was consciously aware of the connection between fantasy film and science fiction film.
Right.
And one of the things that you pointed out here is, in essence, science fiction is a subgenre of fantasy in which the driving force behind the characters and plot is science rather than magic.
Right. So again, if we say, well, what's sort of the essence of what's going on? Well, if in fantasy it's magic, and if we say, well, what's going on with science fiction isn't a plot where basically anything could happen because of this amazing super technology. Isn't that fantasy? And the answer is yes, of course that's fantasy. And the only difference is that instead of magic, it's technology or science. That's the driving force. And of course, we get to, I think I begin the chapter with that wonderful quote from Arthur C. Clarke, that any sufficiently advanced technology can be perceived as magic. So that there really is no difference between magic and science. Magic is just a technology that we don't understand.
Now that you've said it, it's clear as a bell. But up until then, I don't know that I correlated the two. And that's so mind-blowing to me. It's so eye-opening. And I'm so appreciative.
Yeah, there are places in this world where you can take your cell phone, and it won't have you won't have a signal, but you can just show what you can do with your cell phone to the people living in that part of the world, and they would think it's magic. They would think that that little box is magic.
No, absolutely. You're 100%.
They have no other way to understand it.
I mean, even if we go back 20 years and show them the technology we have now,
Sure.
we would think the same thing. So absolutely. And then there are a number of things, throughout the book that you just mentioned in passing. You maybe spent a paragraph or two on it, and they hit me pretty hard. I was like, oh my goodness, he's absolutely right. And I want to just talk about two of them very quickly. One of them is in the fantasy genre chapter, where you talk about frogs and toads and that they're symbols for metamorphosis.
Right.
Yeah, expand on that, because now all of a sudden I'm thinking back to all these movies where, like Magnolia and other things where I've seen frogs all over the place. And I'm like, oh, I have to go back and watch that again. Was there a metamorphosis going on? Like, I know that's a reference to a religious thing that happened, but it just brings a whole different layer of meaning to a story. Can you expand on the symbolism of metamorphosis?
Sure. Okay. So, and that specific symbolism, I believe I borrowed from Bruno Bettelheim in this wonderful book that he wrote, although it turns out that he plagiarized a lot of it. But the book was called The Uses of Enchantment. And in it, he explores fairy tale and fantasy, and he gives these rather Freudian interpretations of these symbols, which are nonetheless, good interpretations. So the idea that, so if you take a fairy tale like The Frog King, which Disney made, I think they called it The Frog Prince. Mm-hmm. In that fairy tale, where the princess has to kiss the frog and the frog turns into a prince, Bettelheim explains, well, what's kind of going on here is this idea that for, say, a 12-year-old girl who's the typical protagonist in a fairy tale, a girl who is on the border of becoming a woman, what is the scariest thing? Again, we get back to fear. What is the scariest thing for the child at that moment? Well, you can imagine a 12-year-old girl whose parents are telling her, well, by this time next year, you'll be married and, you'll be possibly even pregnant by then. That's scary. So how does the child deal with that? Well, again, she deals with that through escape into a fantasy world. So everything then becomes a symbol. The prince that she's going to marry isn't a prince, it's a frog. And the prince is disgusting because frogs are disgusting and slimy and gross. But the lesson that's told is that if you can somehow find a way of accepting this thing, which at the moment seems gross and disgusting and horrific, and if you accept it and give it time, it grows into something else. And then that becomes a sort of the great symbol for the character themselves. You yourself will metamorphosize. You yourself will change as a process of time, as a process of development, but more importantly, as a process of learning, as a process of figuring out who you are and what your relationship is with the other people that you have to relate to. So that's sort of the symbolism of the frog, that just like a frog in and of itself metamorphosizes from tadpole to frog, from a fish-like being to a reptile type being, so too the girl in the story is going to have to metamorphosize from girl to woman. And how does that happen? Well, it happens by the thing that she fears the most, the prince that she's supposed to marry. That metamorphosizes from a gross, disgusting frog to a handsome young prince. So metamorphosis is sort of the key symbol in all of the characters and in all of the parts of the story itself.
Wow. Just more wow. In chapter 10, you use the breakdown of The Shape of Water, another Del Toro film. And something that, I watched in the movie, and I think it just went right over my head, but was the symbolism of the eggs, because
Right.
the deaf character Elisa, she feeds eggs to the amphibious man and
Hmm.
the amphibian man, and I didn't think anything of it. But now I'm
That
looking
means
at
that
your breakdown here, and it's like another mind-blowing discovery.
that means that Del Toro did a good job. Meaning that when you don't notice the symbols, that's exactly that in that at that subliminal level where they're supposed to be. You're not supposed to notice symbols unless you're somebody like me whose job it is to not only notice them but show how the screenwriter is using them. So it's supposed to be subliminal. And the wonderful thing about a well-made symbol within a film is that you'll see it a dozen times, but it will never connect that connection in your mind that, oh, the filmmaker is using that as a symbol for the development of the character. It never hits you explicitly, but as the film progresses and the character progresses, everything that happens seems to happen naturally. At no point you're like, oh, I don't understand why all of a sudden she wants to have sex with this reptile thing. Like that makes zero sense in terms of just progression of plot. But it's all the symbolism. It's the egg and it's the water and it's all these different little uses of visual symbols that represent the development of her character that shows, okay, she has reached a point in herself where, like an egg, she has metamorphosized from a thing that's very fragile and soft on the inside to something that's very tough and something that you can't possibly break because the shell itself is meaningless because she's strong on the inside. Um, that's the symbol of her character, and the fact that you see the egg about a dozen times in the film, but it doesn't hit you that this director is using that very deliberately as a means of character development. Means that he's doing it right. He understands the psychology of film, and he's applying it correctly.
No, I mean, you're right. Eggs are associated with female fertility and sexuality as well as rebirth. And
Yeah.
once again, I'm like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. So I'm watching this movie, and there's so many more layers that go on. And that's why movies like that win Best Picture. You
Yeah.
know,
And it's also why movies like that become people's favorite movies. Somebody's favorite movie is their favorite movie not because they saw it once and they liked it, because they watched it a dozen times at least, and they keep watching it even though they don't exactly know why. But it's all that symbolism. It's the richness of the experience. If you look at any frame from any Del Toro film, same thing with Wes Anderson or John Ford, any great director, you look at a single frame and you're seeing symbols. You're seeing uh, the essence of the film itself visually displayed in the way the characters are blocked, or in the way that a symbol is set up in the background, or in the way that the characters are posed next to each other. Meaning that everything is symbolic and everything is important. And good films give you that sense and they reel you in, and you can watch it a million times because each time you're seeing something different, even if you're not aware you're seeing something different. Your mind sees a lot more than your eyes think. Sorry, your eyes see a lot more than your mind thinks they see.
no, there's no doubt about that. And the more that we as writers can find these tools and implement them like these great directors and these great writers have, the more successful I think we'll be. I want to end here talking about something you mentioned, the conclusion. You started off with saying, as with any creative endeavor, screenwriting is a largely unconscious process. Where do our ideas for stories and characters come from? And you say they come from within. Can you expand on that?
I think that's true. I mean, no matter how professional one becomes as a writer and working on assignment and not necessarily coming up with your own scenarios or your own characters, we all have to breathe life into our scripts. And that breath of life comes from within. Where else is it going to come from? I think we've all seen movies where clearly the screenwriters just took bits and pieces of ideas and characters from other movies and kind of stitched them together. And it worked sort of, but it wasn't great. And then we've all seen movies that really opened our eyes, a movie like Shape of Water, and we realized, well, how can a director or a writer or writer director create this world that's so full of imagery and so full of symbols and so full of these characters that are so real? And that only has to come from within. You can't stitch together by the art of collage meaningful characters in a way that's going to be all inclusive and immersive in the way that these great directors do it. They have to have a story inside themselves that they want to tell. And usually we don't really know why those stories are important to us, or why there's a specific character, a mermaid who doesn't know she's a mermaid, for instance, why that character is important for us and why we have to tell that story. Oftentimes it's only revealed to us when we're done with the story. And then maybe someone watches it and says, oh, that reminded me of so-and-so. And you're like, oh, that's why I wrote that character. Or that's why I wrote that story. We just sort of follow our nose. And which is a good thing to do, but sometimes we get lost following our nose, and that's where a book like maybe the one that I wrote or other books become useful, because they provide some structure, and what the structure does is it helps you look inside your own process and say, okay, I created this character who's very nihilistic and violent and angry. Why? What purpose is that character serving other than just being the villain in the story? What about me have I put into this character that's telling something personally about me? And if you can get into that, if you get into the personal while also serving structure and serving plot and serving story, you tell a very personal story in a way that's going to communicate to millions because it has these core elements of structure and plot and character, then you've done the great thing. You've told a timeless story in a way that's going to be relevant to people in your time. And you've told a story that can reach everyone, but at the same time, it's a specific story about your own journey.
No,
in the version of other people's characters.
No, that couldn't be more beautifully said. I know that I have students who are so often doing the exact opposite, that they're seeing something and, oh, I'm going to write about that, when they don't realize what you actually need to be writing about is what's inside of here. You can use that as a conceptual world or something, but you need to, find that story from within.
We live in this dichotomous world where we think it's one or the other. And somebody asks you, oh, how do you write a good screenplay? Like as if there's an answer for that. How do you write a good screenplay? Is it your own personal story, or is it structure and the craft of screenwriting itself and your knowledge of what makes a good film? And of course, it's both. And if you take either of those elements out, it's not a good film anymore.
Absolutely. Nope. I couldn't agree with you more. William Indick, Dr. William Indick, Psychology for Screenwriters, Building Conflict in Your Script. Fascinating. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed the conversation. Can you tell us when this book is coming out and where they can, read more about stuff that you've done?
Sure. The second edition of Psychology for Screenwriters will be coming out in January 2023. And probably the easiest way to find out other books that I've written or things that I've written would be to Google my name, because no one else with my name in the world. You to a place like maybe my Amazon.com author page that will list all of my books. I have a LinkedIn page that has a lot of these interviews that I've been doing about screenwriting. And yeah, I would say between those two websites, my Amazon.com page and LinkedIn page, you can get a good leads to other sources of information about psychology in film and psychology for screenwriting.
No, hey, thank you so much for writing such a wonderful book. And B, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to someone like me. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Happy to do it again one day.
I hope we will. Thank you again, and until next time. Thank you so much for watching this video, and as a small token of my appreciation, I want to offer you a free video course on how to outline your screenplay. I normally charge $299 for this course, but for a limited time, it is free. Now, it is a 5-day course, but I'm giving you 7 days to finish this outline, okay? After 7 days, that course goes away. So if you're not dedicated and you don't want to knock out a killer outline for your screenplay, don't do it. But if you do, click the link below. I can't wait to hear how you like it.